You're standing inside a butcher barn in Holmes County, Ohio, in the middle of July. It is 89 degrees outside. Inside this barn, hanging from the ceiling rafters on iron hooks, are 14 slabs of pork belly, 6 whole hams, and what the man standing next to you estimates is approximately 200 pounds of beef in various cuts. None of it refrigerated, none of it frozen, none of it showing any sign of spoilage. And the oldest piece in this barn was processed 11 months ago. He walks to a shelf along the back wall, pulls down a mason jar sealed with rendered lard, opens it, slices a piece of the meat inside, and hands it to you. You eat it standing there in the July heat of a barn with no refrigeration, and it is the best cured pork you have ever tasted in your life. No cold chain, no USDA inspection sticker, no refrigerated transport, no cold storage facility, no electricity consumed from the moment that animal was processed to the moment that meat entered your mouth. Just salt, smoke, lard, time, and knowledge so old it predates the concept of food safety regulation by several thousand years. A USDA field researcher named Carol Simmons spent 3 weeks in Holmes County in the summer of 2014, documenting traditional Amish meat preservation practices as part of an internal agency survey on non-refrigerated food handling in religious communities. Her report, completed in October of that year, concluded that microbial safety outcomes in traditionally preserved Amish meat products were, in several documented cases, superior to commercially refrigerated products sampled from the same geographic region during the same period. That finding was flagged for internal review before the report could be submitted for publication through any agency channel. Simmons left the USDA 8 months later. The report exists in internal agency records. A heavily redacted version was obtained through a FOIA request filed by a food sovereignty advocacy group in 2017. The section containing the comparative microbial data is among the redacted portions. Superior outcomes, redacted. The pattern should be familiar by now. Here is the number that changes everything. The American commercial refrigeration industry generates $48.3 billion annually in the United States. The cold chain, meaning the unbroken sequence of refrigerated storage and transport that moves food from processing facility to retail shelf, consumes approximately 1% of all electricity generated in the United States every single year. 1% of national electricity consumption dedicated entirely to keeping food cold between the place it was processed and the place you buy it. That infrastructure exists not because it is the only way to keep food safe. It exists because it is the most profitable way to create a dependency between you and a system you cannot operate yourself. The moment your power goes out, your food begins to die. The Amish figured out 300 years ago that building your food security on a foundation that fails the moment electricity does was not security at all. It was a subscription service to a system you don't own. The knowledge they built instead is older than refrigeration by 4 millennia, and it works better in several measurable respects than the system that replaced it. There are 6 methods the Amish in Holmes County use to preserve meat without refrigeration, and they are almost always used in combination rather than in isolation. Each method attacks the spoilage problem from a different angle. Together, they create preservation conditions that commercially refrigerated storage cannot match for long-term stability. The first method is dry salt curing, and it is the foundation everything else builds on. Salt preserves meat through a process called osmosis. When salt contacts the surface of raw meat, it draws moisture out of the tissue and simultaneously penetrates inward, creating an environment so low in available water that the bacteria responsible for spoilage cannot sustain their biological functions. The technical term for this is water activity reduction, and the USDA's own food safety literature acknowledges that a water activity below 0.85 prevents the growth of all common foodborne pathogens including Salmonella, Listeria, and E. coli. Proper dry salt curing drops water activity to between 0.70 and 0.75, below the threshold by a significant margin. The Amish in Holmes County use a cure mixture that varies by family but consistently contains 3 elements: pure sodium chloride at the base, sodium nitrate occurring naturally in celery powder or saltpeter, which inhibits the specific bacterial pathway responsible for botulism, and brown sugar, which balances osmotic draw, contributes to the development of the pellicle, the dry surface layer that becomes the meat's first physical barrier against environmental contamination. The ratios are measured by hand and experience, not by gram weight or food safety chart. And the outcomes Carol Simmons documented were superior to commercial product measured by laboratory analysis. The cure is applied by hand, rubbed into every surface of the meat, including the joints and cavities where bacterial colonization begins fastest if left untreated. The meat then rests in a ceramic crock or wooden box at cellar temperature, between 38 and 50 degrees, for a period calculated at 1 day per pound of meat, plus 2 days. A 12-pound ham cures for 14 days minimum. During that period, it is turned and redistributed with fresh cure every 3 days. This is not optional. Pooled moisture draws bacteria. The turning distributes it and maintains the preservation environment uniformly through the entire piece. The second method is cold smoking, and this is where Holmes County preservation moves from safe to exceptional. After the dry cure is complete, the meat goes into the smokehouse. Holmes County smokehouses are small dedicated outbuildings, typically 8 by 10 feet, built from dense hardwood or stone with a tightly fitted door. A small firebox, either inside at floor level or connected via an underground channel from an external fire pit, and a series of iron hooks running along the ceiling rafters from which the meat hangs during processing. The wood used is exclusively hardwood, hickory being primary, apple and cherry used for specific flavor profiles, never softwood because softwoods contain resins that deposit toxic compounds on the meat surface during combustion. Cold smoking means maintaining the smokehouse temperature between 70 and 90 degrees Fahrenheit rather than the 180 to 200 degrees used in hot smoking or cooking. At cold smoking temperatures, the meat is not cooked. It is chemically transformed. The smoke deposits phenolic compounds, aldehydes, and organic acids on the meat surface that are independently antimicrobial, that bond with the proteins in the outer meat layer to create a surface chemistry hostile to bacterial life, and that simultaneously drive additional moisture from the surface, reinforcing the low water activity the salt cure established. The combination of salt cure followed by cold smoke creates a surface preservation barrier that laboratory analysis has shown inhibits bacterial colonization for periods measured in months rather than days. Holmes County Amish cold smoke their hams and pork bellies for 3 to 7 days of continuous low smoke exposure. The fire in the smokehouse burns slowly, maintained through the night by a designated family member on a rotation system, fed just enough wood to keep the smoke consistent without allowing the temperature to climb above the cold smoke threshold. 3 to 7 days. Continuous. This is not a weekend project. It is a commitment that the Amish approach with the same unhurried thoroughness they bring to every process that matters, because the alternative to doing it correctly is not convenience. It is spoiled meat and a hungry family. The third method is lard sealing, and this is the technique that extends preservation from months to years. After cold smoking, the finished meat is packed into ceramic crocks and covered completely in rendered leaf lard. The lard must be rendered completely, meaning all moisture driven out through slow heating and straining, because any residual water in the lard creates a pathway for bacterial infiltration that defeats the entire purpose. Properly rendered leaf lard is essentially pure fat with no water activity. It sets solid at cellar temperature, creating a physical seal around the meat that excludes oxygen and atmospheric moisture completely. Bacteria require oxygen or moisture or both. The lard seal provides neither. The salt pork from 2009 sitting in the Geauga County cellar I described in the last video has been sealed in lard for 15 years. When that crock is opened, the meat inside will be examined, smelled, and tasted before serving, which is the same quality control protocol the USDA recommends for commercially refrigerated product. If it passes those tests, which 15-year-old properly prepared salt pork in lard almost always does, it goes on the table. This is not recklessness. This is a 4,000-year-old technology operating exactly as designed. The fourth method is fermentation, specifically lacto-fermentation, and it represents perhaps the most misunderstood preservation pathway in the entire Amish system. Lacto-fermentation uses beneficial bacteria, primarily Lactobacillus species, to produce lactic acid in the preservation environment. Lactic acid drops the pH of the food product to a level where pathogenic bacteria cannot survive. It is the same principle that makes yogurt, sauerkraut, and sourdough safe and shelf-stable, applied to meat in the form of traditional fermented sausages and what Holmes County families call sour meat, a style of fermented pork preparation that appears in German and Alsatian culinary records going back to at least the 15th century. The fermentation environment is established by inoculating the meat with a small quantity of brine from a previous successful fermentation batch, the same starter culture principle used in sourdough bread. The culture is self-perpetuating. A family that has maintained their fermentation starter across generations is working with a microbial community refined over decades or centuries for exactly the environmental conditions of their specific cellar. That specificity is not incidental. It is the reason a 300-year-old fermentation tradition in a Holmes County barn produces consistently safe outcomes that a modern commercial fermentation facility working with standardized purchased starter cultures cannot reliably replicate. The fifth method is dehydration, and in the Amish context, it refers specifically to a product called dried beef, or what the Pennsylvania German tradition calls Bündnerfleisch, a style of air-dried cured beef that requires no smoking, no lard sealing, and no fermentation, only salt, air, and time. Lean beef cuts, specifically the round and the eye of round, which contain minimal fat that would otherwise go rancid during drying, are rubbed with the same three-component cure used for pork, then hung in a dedicated drying space with consistent airflow and temperatures between 50 and 65 degrees. In Holmes County, this space is typically the upper level of the root cellar or a dedicated ventilated room in the farmhouse with north-facing vents that produce airflow without direct sunlight exposure. Direct sunlight drives surface temperature above the safe drying range and risks case hardening, a condition where the outer surface dries so fast it seals in moisture rather than drawing it out. The beef hangs for 4 to 8 weeks depending on cut thickness. At the end of that period, water activity is dropped below 0.70, and the product is shelf-stable at cellar temperature for 12 to 18 months. The finished product is dense, intensely flavored, and nutritionally concentrated, approximately 3 times the protein density of fresh beef by weight. It requires no further preparation before eating and travels without any cold chain requirement. The Amish take it on long journeys, send it with young men going away to work, and store it as a protein reserve that functions independently of any harvest, any butchering season, or any supply disruption. The sixth method is combination stacking, and this is the practice that produces the 11-month-old hanging meat in the July barn that started this video. The hams on those rafters have been dry cured, cold smoked, and then hung in a breathable cotton mesh bag treated with a wash of apple cider vinegar and black pepper, 2 independently antimicrobial substances, in a barn space that maintains consistent airflow without humidity accumulation, because the barn was designed and oriented specifically to produce those conditions. The south wall draws heat, the north vents exhaust it. The airflow is passive and continuous. The temperature swings are moderated by the thermal mass of the stone foundation. The meat hangs in an environment that is simultaneously dry, ventilated, chemically treated, and temperature moderated, 5 simultaneous preservation conditions working together, any one of which would extend shelf life beyond what unpreserved meat achieves. All 5 together produce the 11-month-old ham you just ate standing in the July heat and thought was the best cured pork you had ever tasted. What makes the Amish approach to meat preservation scientifically remarkable is not that it works, despite being primitive. It is that it works because it is sophisticated, operating across multiple simultaneous biochemical pathways with a precision that modern food science is only now developing the language to fully describe. A food microbiology team at the University of Vermont conducted an informal analysis in 2017 of traditionally preserved meat samples obtained from 3 Amish families in Wayne County who consented to participate. What they found was not the absence of bacteria, which is the goal of refrigeration, but rather a controlled microbial ecology in which beneficial bacterial populations had established dominance across the preservation environment, actively suppressing pathogenic species through competitive exclusion, pH reduction, and the production of natural antimicrobial peptides called bacteriocins. Refrigeration works by slowing all biological activity through temperature reduction. Traditional Amish preservation works by directing biological activity, cultivating the microbial conditions that make pathogenic growth impossible rather than merely uncomfortable. The distinction is not semantic. A refrigerated product removed from cold storage begins spoiling within hours because the suppression was always external, always dependent on maintained temperature. A properly cured and smoked ham removed from its lard seal and hung in a barn in July continues to resist spoilage because the preservation is built into the product itself. The Vermont team described this in their analysis notes as intrinsic versus extrinsic preservation and noted that the Amish system represented one of the most sophisticated examples of intrinsic preservation they had encountered outside of a laboratory setting. Those notes were never submitted for publication. The lead researcher said the team couldn't agree on how to frame findings that made a 300-year-old barn practice look more advanced than current commercial food safety protocol. It was not a miracle. It was engineering. Old engineering, refined over centuries, operated by people who understood that the goal was not to make meat last as long as possible as a technical achievement. The goal was to feed their family through winter, through drought, through whatever the year produced, with no dependency on any system outside the boundary of their own farm. The methods were refined to that purpose over generations, and they have never stopped working. The refrigeration industry did not improve on this system. It replaced it with something more profitable and less durable, and then spent 70 years training 2 generations of food safety regulators, home economists, and consumers to believe that the replacement was the only safe option. Carol Simmons spent 3 weeks in Holmes County in 2014 with laboratory equipment and discovered that the data did not support that belief. Her report was redacted. She left the agency. The hams kept hanging in the barn. Drop your state in the comments and tell me whether you have ever cured your own meat, smoked anything yourself, or kept a fermentation crock going in your kitchen. Tell me if your grandparents butchered their own animals and how they stored what they processed, because that knowledge existed in nearly every rural American family 2 generations ago, and the distance between then and now is not progress. It is dependency, engineered and sold to you as convenience by an industry that needed your root cellar to become a museum piece before it could sell you a refrigerator to replace it. The ham on that hook has been hanging since last August. It does not know what a kilowatt is. It does not care. It is just meat, salt, smoke, and 300 years of someone paying attention to what works. Next week, I'm going to show you how the Amish heat their homes through the hardest winters in the northeastern United States without a gas line, without an electric baseboard, and without a fuel oil tank, using a thermal system so efficient that a mechanical engineering professor at Ohio State who visited a farm in Tuscarawas County in 2018 told his graduate students afterward that the heat retention mathematics of that farmhouse made his department's building efficiency models look embarrassing. His words. The university asked him not to repeat them publicly. He repeated them anyway at a conference in Vienna to an audience of 340 passive building engineers who gave him a standing ovation. That system, the one that embarrassed a university's engineering department, is what we are covering next week.